The forgetting curve is one of the biggest challenges you will face when trying to learn literally anything you could want. Having profusely bothered my physiology and neurobiology professors in college and research into the subject, my goal is to make it so that you come away with an understanding of how to learn and retain your skills and knowledge before you lose your hard-earned work. When you learn something new, your brain is like a sponge, but it doesn't hold onto that information forever. You see, about 100 years ago, psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus studied and created something called the forgetting curve. A curve that shows how fast we forget things after learning them. And he was able to find that without proper reinforcement, you can lose almost 90% of everything you've learned within 1 week. You see, when you first learn something, your brain begins processing it for storage. But if you don't revisit that information or skill pattern quickly, your brain will quickly begin letting go of that information. And it's the forgetting curve that quantifies this drop off in memory retention. And if you really want to know how fast it happens, here's a breakdown of how much you might lose over any given amount of time. Day 1. The drop starts quickly. After 20 minutes, you might lose up to 40% of what you just learned. This is because the brain is deciding if that information is worth committing to long-term memory at all. Then after 1 hour to about the end of the first day, memory retention can drop to about 55 to 60% without any further review or practice. Which brings us to day 2, the big drop. By the next day, your retention might fall to about 30% or 40-ish of what you originally learned. This is the steepest part of the forgetting curve, as your brain will prioritize other tasks and let unused information just slip away. From day 3 to 7, memory and skill loss still occurs, but the rate of decline slows down compared to the dramatic drop-off of the first 48 hours. By day 3 specifically, retention might be around 20 to 30% of what you originally learned if you haven't revisited or practiced it. But by day 6, retention could drop to about 15 to 20% total. But notice here, the decline is less steep because your brain has already forgotten the less important details and is holding on to fragments it thinks might be useful. And by day 7, the plateau starts. Cause it's here without any further reinforcement, your retention levels out to just 10, maybe 20% of what you learned. Cause it's here at this point, you've likely retained only fragments, perhaps the basic idea, but not the details or complexity of what you learned. But here's the kicker, forgetting isn't failure. This curve is simply your brain's way of making room for what it thinks is more important. If you do not revisit the information or use it in some way, your brain decides it's not worth the effort to store for the long term. This is why the very thing many of us find so hard, being consistency, is vital to learning and ingraining any skill we could ever want. Think of it like this. It takes a low level of intensity over a long period of time where you're learning or practicing something consistently 3 or maybe 4 times a week for something like an hour at a time to get the skill. And here's the good news. Once you've deeply learned something, once it's finally part of your long-term memory, whether it's math or a skill that you can and have used, the forgetting curve slows down dramatically. Think about skills like riding a bike or doing a backflip. Even if you take a break, you might get rusty, but the foundation you built stays. That is, if you know how to get around the huge challenge you should know about that has something to do with the brain's need to destroy everything to become as efficient as it possibly can. And hey, if you want to protect your brain in the real world from the stresses that come with everyday life, then this video's sponsor, Aura, will help you do just that. Think about a time when a company you trusted announced a data breach involving your personal information. What went through your mind as you processed the news? What actions did you take to respond? Consider the National Public Data Breach of 2024. This incident compromised over 2.9 billion records used for background checks, including critical personal information such as full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and most importantly, social security numbers you name it. Your data is safeguarded using the same security standards as banks and the military. Plus, Aura will never sell your data to third parties. I get this all in one app at one affordable price. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches and brokers, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/tricktheory to try 2 weeks for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. Now, you may have heard that the brain has about 86 billion neurons and over 100 trillion neural connections, or synapses. I like to think of each neuron as a town, while each synapse is a road that has to be both constructed and maintained over time that link each town. However, knowledge, memories, and learned skills are not necessarily stored or represented by the towns, nor a single road or single synapse, but rather in patterns of roads spread across many towns. That is to say, it's a unique pattern of roads is what allows you to do something that someone else can't. When you learn something new, your brain has to spend lots of resources to build new roads in specific areas, to link specific towns together in a new pattern that gives you a new skill. So when you first encounter something brand new like calculus or a sweet side flip, the brain may have to make 5 to 30,000 new connections that can go into the hundreds of thousands and beyond, depending on how far into the skill you want to go. And as mentioned, it costs resources for the brain to simply upkeep these roads, let alone use them. This is why the brain is vicious in pruning and destroying any roads that you don't consistently use when first learning or building them out. And even while you're practicing day in and day out for weeks to ingrain a new skill, the brain will still destroy any roads that it finds are inefficient thanks to you learning that new skill. And this is really good. Your brain already takes up 20% of our metabolic energy, and it doesn't want to take up 40% by having 200 trillion neurons to look after. In total, the brain can store around 2.5 petabytes or otherwise a million gigabytes of information. This capacity is comparable to about 3 million hours of television shows, meaning you need to leave the TV running continuously for over 300 years to use up all the storage your brain has. Still though, you never really use up all the storage your brain has because of its tendency to prune away synapses or generalize or forget information and skills that just aren't useful. Now, how do we stop the forgetting curve? How do we beat this thing? To really beat the forgetting curve and to lock a skill, let alone everything you learn or want to learn inside your head, this is where something simple yet incredible called spaced repetition comes into play. Spaced repetition is a scientifically backed learning technique that combats the forgetting curve where you strategically time your learning sessions. Imagine that it's basically the polar opposite of cramming. Cause unlike cramming, where you attempt to do everything at once for more or less one time that night before the big test, which leads to rapid forgetting, spaced repetition is where you simply space out your practices right as the forgetting curve is about to take a plunge. Where at the 24, 36, or maybe 48 hour mark, you suddenly review that information or skills you learned the first time before pressing on further to new skills or problems in that same session. And then you simply repeat this pattern over and over for as long as you like. Cause if there's one amazing thing for you to take away from this video, it's that each review session within spaced repetition resets the forgetting curve, but with the astonishing difference that each session causes the next forgetting curve on that skill or material that has been reviewed again to be stretched out, to not be nearly as steep. The old material really gets locked in while the new material heads into its own steep forgetting curve. Basically, this means that over time the intervals between reviews can be stretched, as the constantly reviewed material, even if it's for 15 focused minutes, becomes more and more ingrained. If you really want to master spaced repetition and just have it become second nature, the important key to doing this is knowing that spaced repetition takes advantage of two key brain brain processes. One is known as active recall. When you revisit material after a gap in learning, your brain has to work harder to retrieve it. It has to hunt down and go over whatever memory it has on that subject that it recently allowed to be constructed into roads. And this effort deepens the memory, slows the rate of forgetting, and signals to your brain that that information is important. So it will then go about making those roads much stronger and more permanent. And know that this goes the same for knowledge on subjects like math or any physical skill you could ever want. Heck, if you really want to save more time, you could focus each session on only reviewing the information that you forgot from the previous one. Ultimately, spaced repetition isn't about cramming, it's about playing something of a long game. By reinforcing learning at just the right time, you can turn new knowledge and skills into deeply rooted abilities that stick with you for life. It's like building a solid foundation one layer at a time until it's unshakable. In my own personal experience, this might mean running through the basics of a fancy kick or reviewing old concepts maybe weeks or months after you learn them for a fantastic 20 minutes or so just to keep them fresh. It really doesn't have to be that hard. More so whenever you have to either teach a concept yourself or tie it to a bigger system, one where what you learn becomes the foundation for more advanced levels or skills that go off of that one, like using basic math skills you learn for calculus, or how a butterfly becomes part of a butterfly twist. You're probably going to have a much easier time holding on to the lower level skills after you use them for the bigger ones. But if none of this was very interesting, then I saved one fact for last. The term use it or lose it unfortunately becomes very real because the brain is a master of pruning away connections, all to serve something it's obsessed with, which is pruning away roads to save every last drop of energy that it can. Neural pruning is very real. And if you want to know more, like seeing how smart you can actually become, then check out this video. See you in the next one.